Okay. Hi. So we worked on Cambridge, and same thing, so the flood risk and the resiliency of the city of Cambridge. So to give you guys a little context, this is a map of Cambridge, and you can see the...
Charles River? Charles River?
Yep, so the Charles River is going to run along this way, and it picks out kind of vulnerable assets and populations, but what I really want you guys to see here are the purple shaded areas are kind of the areas that we're focusing on. So the Alewife Fresh Pond area over here, and then East Cambridge over here. Those are going to be the two most vulnerable areas of the map of Cambridge that we're looking at. So context as far as the city of Cambridge goes. Cambridge is a very flat area, so the topography of Cambridge does not really work to its advantage when we're looking at flooding. Like I said, the most at-risk areas are that Alewife Fresh Pond area and the East Cambridge. The flooding that they've seen historically and that they're projecting to see in the future really corresponds with what used to be swamplands or wetlands or marshlands. So it's kind of nice that we can predict where it's going to happen, but seeing that historically it really does correspond and overlap with those areas.
You know, I'm just going to sort of interject for a bit here. So I understand that you guys are studying sort of flood risks from sea level rise, but just to sort of put it out there, the most sort of, the biggest climate event that we should be worried about is actually heat waves in the New England area. So, and also flooding is not only going to happen through sea level rise, there's, intense periods of rainfall.
We're going to talk about that.
We have that. But yes, completely.
Stop me if you're already getting it.
So, once again, continuing on about the context of Cambridge, so looking at the map, the two dams that are really protecting Cambridge right now, at least from sea level rise, are going to be the Amelia Earhart Dam, which is on the Mystic River over here, as well as the Charles River Dam. So just giving you guys kind of the lay of the land. So we met with John Boldock, who is one of the environmental planners in the city of Cambridge. He has been there for about 20 years, and he works on a team of about 6 different planners that are dedicated to environmental and sustainability concerns. So they have a team of planners. Some of them are sustainability planners specifically. Some of them are more focused on environmental issues. So Cambridge is at kind of a different point than the city of Boston. They actually don't have a Cambridge resiliency plan put out yet. They're projected to finish their climate change action plan by 2018. So they're really more focusing on kind of assessing their vulnerabilities and coming up with that plan from a few steps back from where Boston is looking. So we kind of took it back a perspective and looked at funding. So how is Cambridge getting the money to do all of the research that they need and make the assessments that they need to assess their vulnerabilities? And most of their funding is actually coming from the city of Cambridge. So they're not getting federal funds. They're not really applying for grants too much. They have one that they're applying for, which would be federal funds that we'll talk about a little bit later. But it's mostly coming just from the city of Cambridge. With the exception of the Mass Department of Transportation actually did a flood vulnerability assessment that they're using in Cambridge, and they're probably using regionally to assess the challenges. I wouldn't be surprised if the other people working on the project came across the same reports that we did with this MassDOT assessment. So that's the only federal money coming in. But Cambridge and other municipalities are benefiting greatly from this assessment. When we talked to John, he said, yeah, we were planning on doing a very similar type of assessment, but it would have been significantly less sophisticated than what MassDOT did for them. So it's really helpful that they had that. So the climate change vulnerability assessment, identifying Cambridge's physical and social vulnerabilities due to increasing temperatures, heat island effect, more intense storms, storm surge flooding associated with sea level rise. So the vulnerability assessment is really serving as a foundation for new development when they're looking at building new buildings in Cambridge. They are implementing green building technology and resilience technology from here on out. And like I said, that climate change preparedness and resilience plan will be completed in 2018. So they're definitely at a different point in their kind of planning timeline. Two types of flooding we looked at. So some flooding in Cambridge that they're seeing pretty much more so than sea level rise is due to increasing precipitation. But they also are seeing some effects of increasing sea level rise and coastal storm surges. So once again, this is just the map that we showed you initially. But this kind of picks out the vulnerable areas and then the vulnerable assets. So as you can see, there's different areas that are highlighted as the transportation hubs, and different vulnerable populations are going to be highlighted in the red. This is just another map to give you guys context. So we're looking at the 2070 projections as to what we'll see from sea level rise and storm surge flooding. So you really see it being an issue over here in that Fresh Pond area, and then it's a little bit lighter and less affected in the East Cambridge area. And this is a lot of wetland area. So today's floods risks. Like I talked about, Cambridge topography is super flat, so they're worried about that increased precipitation and storm drain flooding specifically from increased precipitation. When we look at the Fresh Pond area specifically, we're mainly worried about two things there. So their drinking water reservoir is actually that Fresh Pond reservoir. So the drinking water in Fresh Pond is actually coming from two reservoirs a little bit west of the city of Cambridge, but the Fresh Pond is actually the holding tank. So they're treating the water there, and they're worried about the need for increased barriers around the pond, as well as they are going to have to adjust the elevation of the dam that's regulating the flow of water into the Fresh Pond reservoir. We're also worried about the transportation hub that is Alewife. So we have a train station there, the Alewife T-stop, which goes, I believe it's the end of the red line. And we're also looking at some major highway networks. So Route 2 feeds right into Alewife, as well as the Alewife Parkway, which connects Mass Ave and Storrow Drive and all that stuff. So we are looking at some significant road infrastructure as well. And when we look at the type of water, if we're kind of ignoring the precipitation but looking at sea level rise, we're worried about salt water. So that salt water can contaminate our drinking water if it gets in, and it's also going to rust and kind of could potentially disrupt the infrastructure of the train system as well, which is an issue.
You know, a couple of things I just want to add. You talked about saltwater intrusion, which is really a huge problem, especially in the marshlands. The more they are going in, the more the local, flora and fauna is perishing, and it's getting spoiled. So if the marshland is not there, even for the storm surges, there's less protection. Yeah. And very interestingly, you bring up the storm drain flooding, and just I think yesterday we were having a sustainability retreat between BU, Harvard, and MIT, because we are exactly trying to figure out the problems that you guys are. Yeah. Is this something
we talk about MIT and Harvard, but
yeah. So a lot of the work that is being done in Cambridge, they are trying to see. They're trying to see what Harvard and MIT have and are doing, so that they can extend that. And especially for the stormwater flood, drain flooding, what is interesting is that only now, it's not only the sea level rise and the precipitation and all that, but also, there is going to be backflow because of the sea level rise, and from the manholes, the water is going to rise.
That's happening in Miami.
And that in Miami, it's called sunshine flooding or day flooding. It's a new term they have.
I saw a film that before the flood. So it shows that all water from
came out. And what is so interesting is that they are looking at the data and the maps, And so they know physically mostly where the manholes are, but they don't know what elevation it is at because there's no record anymore.
Right.
And of course, the elevation has changed since the first, you know, some of the manholes are 100 years old. So even if they knew there was a problem, they don't know exactly which manholes to cover. So it's such a complex problem.
Yeah.
Just to, you know,
I have a
Yeah.
quick question for the Alewife area. Then the risk is primarily from storm drain flooding or excessive precipitation.
Both. So currently precipitation, but looking forward, it's going to be increasingly storm surge and sea level rise.
Okay, so also
Yeah.
sea level rise.
Yeah.
But also, you know, if there is increased intense precipitation within short periods of time, then there is going to be an overflow of the stormwater drains, and then from the manholes automatically it's going to. And what is bad is that in most areas, I think it's combined sewer system. So you have sort of the waste and the storm drainage together, which means that if there is a lot of rain and the capacity is too much, in some areas the contaminated
Yeah.
water will overflow.
John talked about that. Yeah.
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 Oh, lovely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm very excited that you guys have brought those parts up, is my point.
Yeah, so going just more into depth of what we just talked about. So the threat that we're looking at due to storm surge and sea level rise is really kind of a threat that we're looking at in the future. So by 2030, about 1 foot sea level rise is estimated, but by 2070 is really the concern where it could be more than 3 feet of sea level rise. We'll talk a little bit more further in depth about the difference between kind of a 10-year storm and a 100-year storm, but that's going to affect kind of the impacts that Cambridge will see as well. But specifically talking about the two dams, so around 2045 and 2055 is when it's projected that the two dams will start to be flanked, which means that the water will go around the sides. And eventually, about 10 years later, it's projected that the water will start to overtop those dams, which is going to contribute to that sea level rise within the kind of inland of the dams.
And that means how much water it will go into the cities and towns.
Right, a lot. Yeah. Yeah, so same thing. Flood volume will be too large, which will quickly overwhelm available storage, infrastructure. Pump stations will be unable to deal with incoming ocean flows that previously pumped the stormwater out. And then, as we mentioned before, another risk that Cambridge is seeing is the propagated flooding, which is when the water kind of backs up in the piping. Sorry, I lost track. So increased water will propagate flows upstream through existing outfalls and connected pipes to relieve in low-lying areas within Cambridge. So this might cause localized flooding that could occur without even any precipitation at all. So the specific areas that will be heavily impacted pretty much follow the map that we looked at initially. So the Charles River Basin and the port in East Cambridge, which were the kind of more orange highlighted areas on the map. So less so of the Alewife and Fresh Pond area.
All right, so for the next few slides, I'm going to be talking about flood risks just in terms of precipitation, because precipitation flooding is likely to become much more frequent, much more expansive, and a lot deeper. The intensity of the heaviest rain and snowfall events in the Northeast in the United States has increased by 71% over the last half century. So as air, here's a little background. I know we all are probably familiar with how it works, but as air temperatures rise, the atmosphere can hold more water, leading to more intense precipitation events. And the rainfall intensity affects the volume of water that flows across the land, in rivers, and through the stormwater systems. It's projected that extreme rain events will increase in frequency and intensity over the coming years. Reports indicate that the area of Cambridge at risk from this type of flooding is projected to nearly double between now and 2070. The projected future rates of rainfall are shown here. You can see that. So the flood volume generated by the future 10, 25, and 100-year storm events which are relatively large and infrequent storms, is unlikely to be adequately mitigated by increasing physical storage and conveyance capacity. The flooding scenarios assume that the pumps on the Charles River and Amelia Earhart dams are functioning at full capacity. However, to drain all the stormwater downstream and away from the city, but it's extremely unlikely if we're going to be having so many increasing and severe storms. The infrastructure will most likely not be able to hold up. So if those pumps fail, especially in the Alewife Brook area, flooding would be substantially worse. Maintaining and increasing the pumping capacity of the Mystic River's Amelia Earhart Dam is extremely important and essential to preventing and minimizing the flood risks in this area of northern Cambridge. And it's going to require close cooperation among neighboring cities, because this area where the flood would happen is not just confined, it will spread. So there needs to be a lot of cooperation. All right, so the three maps shown here depict a 100-year, 24-hour rainfall events today and in 2030 and 2070. So a 100-year storm means that there's a 1% chance of it occurring in any given year. A 10-year storm means that there's a 10% chance of it occurring in any year. So over these three time periods, the area of the city projected to flood increases from 13 to 18% by 2030, and then up to 23% by 2070. So that is the additional 2.5 inches of rainfall expected in a 2070 100-year storm would flood an area that's almost twice the size of what would be flooded today in a 100-year storm. And then here's like a similar map, but showing 10-year storms, which, so it is covering less of an area, but these is much more likely, there's a higher frequency of this type of storm happening every year. It's 10% chance, not 1%. So the flooding maps help to identify the neighborhoods, streets, and individual structures that are most at risk for flooding. And in addition to the 10 and 100-year events, there's also risks posed by short duration precipitation events for either 1 or 2 hours with intense storms, but there's also long-term events such as like 48 to 72 hour storm events, and these will also have a big impact, though not shown on maps. Like for example, in July 10th of 2010, 3.6 inches of rain fell in a single hour, which exceeded the capacity of Cambridge stormwater system and resulted in significant flooding in several neighborhoods. So these types of storms are projected to become more frequent also.
I will be talking about the Cambridge plan on dealing with flood risk for the next few slides. First, the flood risk can be analyzed with multiple scales: individuals, residential, business and institutions, city, and regional. This makes the problem more complicated. So in our presentation, we split the plans according to different scale, and because the actual plan will only be completed in 2018, so we base all the information on our research and our interview. The first scale we're going to look at is regional. Based on MassDOT vulnerability assessment, flood risk is a regional challenge because within the region, cities and towns share like critical assets. The major one is transit system, like the highway, the T, the train system. And the second one is drinking supply. As we have mentioned before, like towns and cities share freshwater reserves. If the flood water extends to the freshwater reserves, the salt water might damage the drinking water and the water we can use. So a lot of cities will be affected. So the region is thinking about setting up treatment centers for dealing with saltwater in the future, but there's no actual plan yet. The third
Yeah, that's the first I've ever heard of it.
Yeah, just when we were interviewing him, he said that they're planning to do that, but there's no actual plan. And the third critical asset is bodies of water, like the river passing through all the cities and towns. To prevent flooding from the rivers, the region is going to modify the elevation of the dams according to the vulnerability assessment. Within the region, Metro mayors created a climate change preparedness task force, which include 14 cities and towns, and Cambridge is one of them. Cambridge's major task is to communicate with cities along the Mystic River. They're going to set up barriers that can protect the Mystic River coast. There are several challenges facing Cambridge because a lot of cities are involved. So all the cities must negotiate and came to an agreement on where to locate the actual barriers. And also, it is hard to balance the benefits and loss between all the cities of the location of the barriers. And also, the project will involving adjusting water management infrastructure and storage capacity. That's like a huge work. The next scale is city. The city of Cambridge has applied for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration Grant, which is a type of federal funds. The city is going to use this grant to facilitate research on coastal restoration along the Mystic River. Along with the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, Cambridge will working with Boston, Chelsea, and Charlestown. They are going to place new barriers around the shroud buildings in Charlestown, which will prevent flooding for all the cities, including Cambridge, Boston, Chelsea, and Charlestown. The city is also completing multiple projects on infrastructure improvement and renovation, including the sewage system and drainage system, as well as road quality. The Department of Public Works have put all the projects information on their website, and everyone can track the progress of the project online. The next scale we're going to talk about is business and institutions. Businesses are crucial for the city's economy, so the city is helping businesses with resiliency plans. Actually, although a lot of attention have been paid on new construction, the current infrastructure and existing buildings are at the most risk because they don't have like advanced technology or design to prevent flooding. So the city is mainly working with business to help them to improve and renovate old buildings and exist infrastructure. And for new development and new construction, the city is providing guidelines for them to build the building better prepared for the flood. There are going to be a flood risk tool that's going to be soon published online. Institutions are also very important. We took the most important example, MIT and Harvard, in Cambridge's case, because first, their location is really close to the Charles River. And second, they have large, dense population. Third, in MIT's case, it is located on the fielding land, which is historically swampland, and it's predicted to be flooded by 2030. That's why it's really vulnerable. And in the Harvard's case, it is planning to spend hundreds of millions of dollars by the end of this decade to develop its campus share around the Charles River waterfront, which is also really vulnerable to flooding of Charles River. And also, the city shares all the data with MIT and Harvard. This is really important because MIT and Harvard have a lot of professional researchers, and they're really focusing on the climate change research, so they can provide a lot of analysis and help with dealing with those data and help the city better prepare for the climate change and flooding.
And they are themselves are vulnerable community.
Very well said.
According to the New York Times, if the sea level rises by 5 feet, flooding will submerge much of the southern Cambridge, which include the MIT campus. As we can see from the map, the darker blue area is where the extent of flooding will be in 100 to 300 years. And we can see the red spot, that's where MIT campus are located. And those are the 3 main buildings, the Sloan School and the other 2 buildings.
So MIT is the victim of this flooding impact.
Oh, I think not.
And
We're
that's-
working on it, yes, no, absolutely, absolutely, because they're right on the river too. you
Yeah,
know.
yeah. I mean, before, we didn't pay any thought on
No,
these things. We didn't
not at
predict,
all.
just everything is okay.
In fact, all our major cities in the world, we settled by the river,
Yeah,
right?
So what is MIT going to do? MIT's professors and other members of the MIT Climate Change Conversation Committee have been working with the Department of Public Works, Public Health, and Community Development in constructing the climate change vulnerability assessment. It is also further working on the climate change preparedness resilience plan for the city of Cambridge. It also established the plan for action on climate change in 2015 for its own campus. It is also consistently updated content by analyzing new data available. In Harvard's case, Harvard is located at the upstream of rivers, so it is currently protected by the dams located at the Charles River and Mystic Rivers. But if sea level rise, this will diminish the dam's ability to protect the campus. So Harvard's construction of the School of Engineering, Applied Science, and renovation of the Harvard Kennedy School already start to contain designs and technology that allow the construction to be more resilient to flooding and storm surges. Harvard is also moving energy facilities that showing high flood risk in the vulnerability assessment to higher elevation location or like safer location.
So, for example, most recently in a plan that I think it's a new state-of-the-art lab and something facility, huge, I'm forgetting exactly. I think it's engineering and technology lab, something like that in Alston. So, when you speak about energy facilities that they are moving, before they had designed the building so that all the generation and things like that was on the 2nd or the 3rd floor. And then they actually moved the entire sort of local district energy source, if you will, to a higher elevation away from the building, because they weren't even sure in Alston if it would rise to the 3rd level and completely spoil it. So that much they are sort of looking into. And I love that you speak of the sort of partnership or the challenges or the collaborations between the institutions and the city. And this is especially fresh in my mind because just recently one of the conversations we are having is like everybody on the table wants to collaborate, but there are such big and small challenges. So right now we are trying to figure out just how we can all have a common model and common baseline assumptions so that everybody can start to design from there. So just to put it in perspective, let's say the city of Cambridge decides that their building code, all the residential sort of basement, whatever is there needs to be at 15 feet or above, right? Whereas let's say in Winthrop they decide that 7 is okay. Now that's okay at the community or the city level, but then when there's a large sort of insurance mechanism that has to evaluate, then just by virtue of the kinds of things they do for climate preparedness, some cities will become more economically depressed than others because of this uneven codes, And so to bring it back, so how important it is to get Harvard, MIT, and the city to work together. And I just want to sort of say that you guys are on the right track in trying to identify this, but the problem is so much deeper than you can begin to imagine.
Even looking at where they're going to put barriers on the Mystic River, they're concerned with, well, if Cambridge works with a bunch of different cities to choose a location, is it going to negatively affect another city that they didn't even, or town that they didn't even think about. So that's a big challenge that they're dealing with, is being in communication with all of these other cities that have their own interests and whatnot, and residents
Lack
to
of
worry
capacity.
about. Right.
Cambridge is the most,
Right. And money,
So
because even
money,
Cambridge
yeah.
doesn't have a lot of money, and it's Cambridge, so, and no federal funds, so. Yeah.
So Harvard, MIT, and local governments are in the same boat. So we hope they will do.
This information will allow citizens to take the necessary steps they need to help reduce damage caused by flooding, and will make the cleanup process much easier. Its major suggestions include using flood-resistant materials, building exterior flood walls, installing backwater valves, and elevating and relocating utilities. It's all in a really easy to use manual. That's what I really like about this. It's really accessible to anyone of any level. As you can see in this diagram, they label everything so you know exactly where it should go in your house and exactly what they're talking about, which I really liked when I was reading it. So they really urge the residents to take immediate action, highlighting the fact that just a few inches of water can, from a flood, can cause tens of thousands of dollars in damage. And most homeowners and renters insurance do not cover flood damage, so they also provide information for how residents can go about purchasing flood insurance.
And John talked about it being a challenge that they can't really require residents to do anything with their private ownership. So it's literally just urging the residents of Cambridge to make these changes to their buildings, but you can't tell somebody that owns their house that they have to do these flood precautions. So that's something else that they're working with. Sorry.
No, thank you. So at the beginning, Sarah talked about the climate change preparedness and resilience plan that's set to come out in 2018. So I'm just going to talk a little bit more about that. I'm going to refer to it as the CCPR, just to be a little more brief. So the CCPR will have input from many voices, as it's going to be reviewed by the Envision Cambridge advisory committees, which include the Climate and Environment Work Group. And it will be guided by an interdepartmental steering committee, which consists of Public Works, Public Health, and Community Development departments. So the CCPR is also going to be made with a lot of consideration of its citizens, stakeholders, and businesses' opinions through public meetings put on by Cambridge's Community Development Department and by the Envision Cambridge engagement process. So Envision Cambridge is a really interesting organization. They've developed a community-wide process to create a comprehensive plan for a more livable, sustainable, and equitable Cambridge. And some of the strategies that they use include administering street surveys, getting focus groups together, and panel discussions, and a lot more. So it's cool that they're working with this organization to really do as much as they can with its citizens. And next Wednesday, there's actually a public meeting being held at the Russell Youth and Community Center, where community members can attend to learn more about what climate change means for the Alewife Fresh Pond area and contribute to the CCPR. At the meeting, they'll discuss the findings of the climate change vulnerability assessment that they conducted and have a discussion with residents and businesses in the Alewife Fresh Pond area about what should be done and what their role can be going forward.
John really wanted us to go to that meeting.
Yeah.
As well you should.
Yeah.
Everyone should. It should be really interesting.
I know. And that's it.
Yeah,
Any questions?
So any questions from the student side?
That was terrible. Very good.
Thank you.
Excellent.